Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at the Midtown Scholar and thank them for hosting this wonderful event tonight. And David, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for coming to Harrisburg.
Good to meet you, Jeff. Again, thank you for coming tonight. Always a treat to see people here at the bookstore.
And you know, today's an interesting day because it's September 17th. And as a historian, maybe you planned this, maybe it wasn't, but it's Constitution Day, for one. Back in September 17th of 1787, the Constitution was signed in Philadelphia. But it's also the anniversary of the Battle of Antietam, September 17th of 1862. They're about 75 years apart, those two dates, and your story falls in between them, obviously, a little closer to the Civil War, but certainly influenced by the Constitution and really its original sin, which is the ongoing issues around slavery. But before we dive into the book, why did you choose to write this book, A Hell of a Storm?
So I wrote this book in part because I went to a seminar 11 years ago, 2 weeks, Transcendentalism. Obviously, you had to be interested in Transcendentalism to go to a 2-week seminar in July. This was in Concord, Massachusetts, epicenter of Transcendentalism, and just thoroughly enjoyed the people who spoke with us, my fellow seminarians. Tremendous experience. I always wanted to do something with Henry David Thoreau. I massaged him into a project years ago, but wanted to do more about that. Thoreau published Waldo in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was in 1854. There's another figure I talk about in this book, George Fitzhugh, kind of a Southern intellectual. And his book, major work, came out basically a month after Thoreau's. And so the act, Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was introduced in January, all the turmoil and chaos of that year, collapse of the Whig Party, rise of the Republican Party, and then these two interesting books, polar opposites in certain respects, they come out as well, kind of reflecting where the country is, for better or for worse, at that time. And 1854 was just a nice hook. It was a nice excuse to get into some intellectual history, some literary history, and some political history.
Yeah, and we'll go through some of that as we go through tonight's program. But I always like to find out, how long did it take you to do the research for this book and to write it?
Cradle to grave, about 5 years. Half that was the research and half that was the writing.
And you did it during COVID? Is that
sometime? I did do it during COVID. It was a challenge for all of us. We all have that in common. It also, I think, in some respects, helped me to focus because there weren't a lot of distractions. I do remember having to vacate my office at work the third Friday of March, 2020. And before I did, going to the library and basically lugging as many books as I could to my house.
Okay, I think we all have a similar memory, and the shutdown began on my birthday, so there's that. But now, let's get into the book. So, you know, you chose 1854 as the year of your focus, although you kind of talk about the before and after a bit. So what were some of the issues that led up to 1854? Some of the highlights, and particularly beginning really in the 1840s, but take it where you'd like.
Well, sure. So, you know, in the late 1840s, there was a war of choice. A republic, the United States of America, went to war against another republic, Mexico. Didn't have to. It was a war of choice. At the time, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, Mexico will poison us. Militarily, the United States is going to win this war, but we are going to choke on what comes next. What comes next is the issue, the question of what do we do with this land? Free soil or slave soil? And so by the late 1840s, Congress is really wrestling with this. And it's not until 1854 that Congress thinks, after the Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, that it has a solution. But we know that it really wasn't a solution, that it was a quote-unquote political solution that most of the people in the country did not agree with, and so it could not hold.
And you mentioned briefly the Compromise of 1850, and can you tell us a little about what was in that compromise?
Yeah, so there was an attempt to sort of settle the territorial question in regards to territory that was taken from Mexico. And so the North got some things. For example, California came in as a free state. Slavery would continue in the District of Columbia, but the slave trade would be ended. The South got a couple major things. There was a fugitive slave law, which said that for runaway men and women who would go to a free state, they could still be not just hunted down, but law enforcement, the judicial apparatus in northern states, had to be at the bequest of these enslavers as they would track down these fugitives or simply people who they accused of being fugitives. That got into the bone of contention for a lot of people in the North. And also, as far as the territories were concerned that were taken from Mexico, it was not a prohibition of slavery. It was the concept of popular sovereignty, whereas Congress said, look, we've been fighting over this for 3 or 4 years now. We can't come to a decision. So despite the fact that the U.S. Constitution says that territories are under the province of the United States government, they kicked it to essentially what they called the people, tried to put a nice spin on it, democracy, which meant that, that those pioneers, those settlers going into these territories would determine the future status of those territories as they became states, despite the fact that many people said, but this isn't really just about one territory or one state. This is about morality, this is about freedom, this is about the identity of the United States.
And and other people begin to kind of make their presence known. And the Compromise of 1850 was originally introduced by Henry Clay as one big kind of omnibus package, and it failed. Mm-hmm. And then someone named Stephen A. Douglas took over at that and saw it through, and we'll be talking about him probably for the rest of the night. But can you tell us a little bit about Stephen Douglas? Sure.
Yeah, Douglas was a politician from Illinois, originally from New England, had tremendous success, was on the Illinois State Supreme Court when he was in his 20s, was a young U.S. senator. Henry Clay had tried to get this compromise passed through, one big bill, couldn't do it. Douglas chopped it up into individual bills and was able to get it passed through. I think that played a significant role in his thinking. 4 years later, this is going to hell of a storm. The phrase is his. I know that this bill in 1854 is going to cause a hell of a storm. What would make him think that the nation would just easily allow this to happen? And I suppose the answer is because in 1850, he was able to, like a magician, get something through that the great Henry Clay had been unable to get through. So Douglas, who had a healthy ego anyway, saw, I think, this as a real challenge and also a way to solidify himself. The strong percentage of people who were presidents up that time were Democrats. And increasingly, the formula was to move away from Southern Democrats, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and increasingly go with Northern Democrats because of demographic change. You need to find a way to appeal to Northerners, to Yankees. And one way to do that was to nominate Northern Democrats. And so Pierce, Buchanan, and if he had been able to get this through in 1854 without a real collapse of the political system, he probably would have been president in 1860, not Lincoln. That was the direction. And then with Lincoln and the war, American politics spun off in a completely different direction. And all of a sudden, you had something like 7 or 8 presidents from the Midwest, most from Ohio, from about 1860 until the 1920s.
Yeah, it really was a sea change. And the 1850s were a sea change. That group, the Great Triumvirate, for example, you mentioned them. It's Clay, it's Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, all pass away within a couple of years of each other. And men like Douglas and others begin to take that place. And so you see this transfer of power. And so we get up to 1854, and it's Kansas-Nebraska, the Nebraska Act at the time. And at first it was really about railroads, wasn't it? And could you talk a little bit about that and how it morphed into being really about slavery?
Yeah, for Douglas, there were some things that he wanted to see accomplished from this act. And one was to see transcontinental railroads take place. the strongest argument for 1854 without Douglas is that people were already beginning to move into these territories. And it became clear that the government was going to have to do something in regards to organizing them. So something had to take place. Railroads were arteries. The technology existed and the financing to have transcontinental railroads before they were eventually built after the Civil War. And for somebody like Douglas, he imagined that Chicago could be the western terminus for eastern markets, and the western terminus for markets coming in the other direction. Chicago could solidify his base. He could run for the presidency in 1860, 1864. He would be seen as a great compromiser. The Constitution, Compromise of 1820, 1850, Compromise of 1854 that never happened. And he would also be viewed as a great architect of internal development because of his proficiency in seeing railroads expand to the Pacific. It was a great, grand vision. It was a very large vision. And he thought he could pull it off, but he did not take into consideration the fact that the institution of slavery had become a great concern for people in the North. And I'm not speaking principally of abolitionists. There really weren't that many abolitionists, but for people like Abraham Lincoln, who could see that enslaved labor was in competition with free labor. And what do we want the future of the territories of the new states to look like?
And that's a part of the story here, and part of the idea of popular sovereignty is that states or territories out west could vote, decide whether they're free or enslaved. And so much of it had to do with the balance of power, that there was an equal amount of free to enslaved states. And so much, and especially what Lincoln was fighting against, was the expansion of slavery. They weren't necessarily willing or able to shut down slavery completely, but to stop it from moving west. And a lot of people wanted to go back to the Missouri Compromise, which set a boundary between North and South. And you mentioned that it began to get people engaged into this question. And it seems to me that the Fugitive Slave Act itself was the real trigger in many ways for a lot of people in the North to really have that reaction. But there were other people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was very active at that time. Could you tell us what she was thinking about and doing at that point?
So in 1854, Harriet Beecher Stowe was just beginning to live into what it meant to be the best-selling American novelist of the century. Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in 1852. She was a star. She was a celebrity, and she was beginning to, as you note, because of the Fugitive Slave Act, to take a real oppositional stand, more public than what she had been in the past. And this Kansas-Nebraska Act, it contributes to that, because what people like Stowe are able to do, and Lincoln did this as well, is to begin to construct a narrative about what's happening here. And so it's not the South that's doing this, it's the slave power that's doing this. And then you begin to look back in time, and then you begin to construct an argument. To this day, scholars still debate, is this a legitimate way to look at history, or is this, as one historian put it many, many years ago, is this a kind of a paranoid style in approaching the past? Every cause is probably stronger if it has a narrative. And people like Stowe, people like Thoreau, in a different way, contribute to this narrative, because once you begin to see something, you begin to see it in areas that you never would have even looked before. And then you begin to find a common pole, a common motion. And that's the kind of thing that can inspire people, large numbers of people, to leave one political party. In 1854, it was the Whig Party, and to join a new party, the Republican Party, or as its opposition would have it, a radical Republican Party. So people who did not view themselves as radicals were, within the span of a few weeks or a few months in 1854, dropping lifelong political allegiances and joining a brand new party.
And many of these people came to the anti-slavery position or abolition eventually very slowly, gradually, and Harry Beecher Stowe was one of those people. And of course, there was one other historian I spoke with once who said that everybody in the 19th century was a racist. And so you look at these people, and all of them have some racial prejudice. There's quite often talking about wanting to liberate African Americans, but that they weren't equal to whites. You see that over and over again. And another person that you write about is Ralph Waldo Emerson, and how he became an abolitionist. And I just wanted to share a quote that you had in the book that he had, and he was talking about the fugitive slave law, and this sort of highlights what we've been talking about. The filthy enactment was made in the 19th century by people who could read and write. I will not obey it, by God. He wrote that in 1851. So can you talk about how he came to abolitionism?
Yeah, he was always squeamish in regard to slavery. He first encountered, I think, slavery in a real felt sense when he was a young man. He was ill. He went to the South to try to medicate himself. Two of his brothers died of tuberculosis. I mentioned Thoreau. Thoreau would die at 44 of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was one of the great killers up into the 20th century. And he records in a very caustic way how he is in a religious service in South Carolina, and he's listening to the preacher, while outside he could hear a slave sale taking place. He would have been conscious, obviously, of the institution of slavery, but I think that meant something to him. But still, as you note, his path to abolitionism was slow, and actually in places like Concord, it was really, I think, a province of women. So his wife, Henry David Thoreau's mother, and his two sisters, they belonged to an slavery organization in Concord years before their husbands were involved, or sons, or whatnot. And I think the men, I don't want to say that they took their cues, because they also had a moral sense or a moral conscience. But in some sense, somebody like Emerson, who was a public figure, I think was also careful about how much he put out there. So when he says, something along the lines of what you read, it's 1851, it really won't be until the mid-1840s where he will publicly begin to make speeches, oftentimes at the behest of women's groups, to come out and proclaim in favor of British abolitionism on its islands. He does this in 1844. It's the 10th anniversary. Even then, it's still a bit controversial, and he's still just a little bit reticent about coming out and saying, yeah, this was a great thing. I support this.
So women led the way back then, too. So that's great. And, 1854 was also a transitional year for politics. You briefly mentioned this, or for political parties, really. Can you tell us about Allen Bovey, I believe it's pronounced, and the formation of the Republican Party?
Sure. So Bovey is one of these individuals who could see what was happening. The old political structure was being destroyed. It was collapsing really within a few months in mid-1854. So Whiggery is in decline. What replaces it immediately isn't quite clear. There's just a bunch of groups who call themselves different things, including a People's Party, a lot of anti-Nebraska groups. And Bovey is somebody who wants to centralize it under one name, and he says Republican, because that is a name that immigrants are familiar with. So this was a period in which the United States had a lot of immigrants coming in, principally from Ireland and Germany, other areas as well. He said that Republican is something, no matter their language, they recognize it, they know it, and they will embrace it like a friend. Also, there was the Jeffersonian Republican Party, which kind of linguistically had morphed into just the Democratic Party for a shorthand. And people remember Jefferson, an enslaver, but a national figure as well. And so there was resonance and currency with the name Republican. And so Bovey is going to keep pushing and pushing for the name Republican. And finally, he gets the ear of Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, which was the biggest paper in the country at that time, closest thing America had to a national newspaper. And Greeley, he walks kind of slow, but after a few months, he goes for it. And he says to Bovee, not so much because you were pushing me, but because the people are ready now, which in other respects is something that Emerson says or does, and in his own way is something that Abraham Lincoln does as well, kind of walking carefully until they thought the people were ready.
And with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, of course, it opens up Kansas and the Nebraska territories to settlement, and people are beginning to rush in from the south and from the north, and groups are formed that kind of are advocating and helping people to relocate. One of those individuals is Eli Thayer in his Immigrant Aid Society. Can you talk about him and maybe some of the other groups that were doing similar work around this time?
So there was an effort on the part of New Englanders to pool resources and to get New Englanders to go out to the West for freedom. Long story short, it didn't really work. What it required were people from the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Valleys, to go out. But there was this great energy and this great desire to see Yankee sodbusters infiltrate the West. It stirred up opposition from the South. You might have heard the phrase border ruffians. These would be, say, people from Missouri whose desire it was perhaps not so much to settle, but to intimidate and to keep Yankees out. So, you know, it was the common territory, but both Yankees and Southerners viewed it as very much a race for the future. Thinking, you know, whoever gets here is going to really dominate the peopling of the frontier from this point. And it was the question of the future, not so much the present. Is the future going to be the movement of slavery, perhaps even to the Pacific, or free labor?
And this was really the time where violence begins to erupt, or maybe a couple of years later, but certainly at this time period. And things are beginning to really percolate in the country. And there's also this sort of strange attempt, several attempts to acquire additional land, but really by individual citizens. And one that comes to mind is William Walker, and he was known as, I think, a filibuster, correct? Can you tell us who they were and what they were trying to achieve?
Filibusters, they tended to be Southerners. They tended to get support from other Southerners, sometimes with political connections, obviously people with financial connections. And it was an attempt to help to, you know, extend the institution of slavery into places like Nicaragua, Baja California. The great desire was for Cuba. Some of this was seen as a counter to California coming into the Union. It was a big state. There was a desire to, as you mentioned earlier, maintain sort of, you know, at least an equability, if not an advantage, for the South in the Senate, and to bring these territories in. The country obviously had laws that said it was illegal for American citizens to go to foreign countries and make war on these groups. We had treaties with these countries, but still it did not stop certain administrations from sometimes surreptitiously either aiding or just sort of looking the other way. William Walker was from Tennessee. He was very interesting, had a law degree, had a medical degree. By the time he was like 28, and it was never enough. He was an adventurer is what he was. And he became, you know, the leader of a you know, Latin republic for a small period of time before the British kicked him out, thinking about the desire maybe of building an oceanic canal, and they wanted the territory for themselves. And eventually Walker would be captured and he would be executed in Central America. Northerners would look upon this not as an individual, but as an expression of the South's desire to do whatever it took to move slavery into Nebraska or to try to move slavery into Nicaragua by legal means or illegal means.
And in the North, there was a continued reaction, a growing reaction to the Fugitive Slave Law. And of course, escaped enslaved people had gone through the North for generation. But at this point, things were beginning to change. And there was one case in Boston in particular, a case of Anthony Burns, an escaped enslaved person. Can you tell us his story and the community's reaction to that?
So Burns had escaped from Richmond, Virginia, and he was in Boston, and his enslaver wanted him back, and so went up to Boston and had a few men under his direction, and they captured him. So this is 1854. The fugitive slave law has been around for 4 years. Long story short, they find it extremely difficult not to identify the fact that this man is Anthony Burns, but to then bring him back to Virginia. Thousands of troops, some federal, some local, some state, have to be brought in because Boston is under siege, in a sense. So many people have come, some just because it's an event, but so many have come to protest this. And so Anthony Burns is taken through a file. The army has sort of, they're marching him through. They're barricading some of the side streets. I don't think that there were any casualties that day except a horse was killed. People are throwing things. People are shouting things. And, of course, they've got to march through what's now the Freedom Trail of downtown Boston. There's where the Boston Massacre took place. And so for those Bostonians who thought that they knew what it meant to be a Bostonian, what it meant to be an American, about freedom, this had the impact, I think, of waking them up in a way that that a pamphlet or a book or a congressional action passed 500 miles away in D.C. It didn't have, because it was bringing the injustice of enslavement right to them, and it made them feel, I think in some sense, that they were participants in this particular travesty.
And this is also 1854. We're talking about a year of change, and it's also the year that Abraham Lincoln kind of reappears and really begins to take a national role. In fact, you write that in its considerable commotion, meaning 1854, few benefited from the chaos, quite like Lincoln. Can you talk about that and what he was doing at this point?
Lincoln was a one-term congressman, and his term was up a few years earlier. And so he's in Springfield. He's practicing law. He's a pretty good lawyer. He's got a nice house. He's got good clients, primarily with the railroads. And if he had any political aspirations at all at this time, it was to be in the U.S. Senate. But that really wasn't even on his mind in 1854. He was a Whig, a diehard Whig. He had served his one term. He had agreed with others, if you support me, I'll support you. He didn't really think he was going to ever get back into politics. But this was such a dynamic thing that happened in 1854, and it really did crack open the political universe. It's not the same thing today, but things have been happening over the last 3 or 4 months in American politics that have changed, some of our outlooks on what might be happening in the future. Stay tuned. So for Lincoln, there was this chaos, there was this upheaval, and he proved to be somebody who, under the circumstances that existed in America in 1854, was somebody who really could not be president. But after 1854, he's the kind of person, increasingly, because of what happens with Anthony Burns, with what happens with Kansas-Nebraska, he has that kind of a profile that in 1860 is what enough people in enough states were looking for.
And so that, as we're getting close to our time, we see the passing of a few people from the political stage and new folks entering, as you just mentioned, has some rhyme to what's happening today. But in summation, what do you want people to take away from this book?
I suppose the possibilities of American politics and how quickly our politics, but also our culture changes. I know sometimes I find myself getting into a groove in my thinking, and what what really amazed me always about the period of the 1850s is how things changed, how the normal could quickly become outdated, and also how quickly then we seek to try to find ways to accommodate this and to try to feel like we aren't living through change or we aren't living through a revolution or something, but rather it's the tried, it's the true, it's the traditional, it's the desire for that next compromise. In 1854, the compromise that didn't happen. I also just wrote it because I think it's a fascinating part of our history, and I hope that for readers they'll pick up on that interest and deepen their own particular interest in that period, and perhaps also see its application beyond 1854.
Well, as one of the first readers of the book, I can say you did a great job with that. And I think when you purchase it and when you read it, you'll fill in all the details that we weren't able to get to today. But David, thank you so much for being here and for joining us. And we'll turn it back to Alex for some Q&A.
Yeah, let's give him a round of applause. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I will come around with the mic. We'll start in the middle there.
Yeah, Dr. Brown, the between 1820 and 1850, those two compromises in there, and the period you've been talking about here in the 50s, mid-50s and 54, you made an allusion a couple of minutes ago about other things that were happening. When I think of this time, I'm thinking it's the North and the South. They were against each other. It was all about slavery, the free states and the slave states. So could you just give us, I'm guessing, as you were writing this book, you must have said to yourself many times, oh, this is just like today because we as a country are divided, over different issues. Could you give us a couple more examples of how things that happened in your book between those fighting the free states and how it's like today? As you're writing this, I'm sure you were thinking, oh yeah, this is just like now.
Yeah, I always struggle when I think, about history in the current day, because I find so many things that are overlapping. And so on one hand, I'm thinking, oh, thank goodness, right? I mean, we sort of been down this path before. But then again, I'm not sure I really want to go down that path again. So what I noticed when I was researching this book is misinformation, a lot of it purposeful. That's not a new thing. So fake news was not invented 5 or 10 years ago. There's always been, fake news. I noticed that, by the late 1840s, 1850s, there was less consensus in the culture, and so there was less room for politicians to compromise, because it's not what their constituents wanted, and politicians wanted to be reelected. I think I also noted that there were real questions about democracy. And so in the 1850s, you have something like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or a few years later, the Dred Scott decision. And I look at those two decisions, and I'm thinking the bulk of the country, not 80%, but 50 plus 1 or 50 plus 2, would have been, I think opposed, definitely to the Kansas-Nebraska. I suspect also to the Dred Scott decision. And so you're living in a democracy, and you're saying, but is this serving the majority? Is this what the people want? And I think today about reproductive rights. I think today about attitudes towards the Supreme Court and questions about, are these government structures there to serve the people, or are the people there to serve the government structures?
I mean, talking about the Compromise of 1820, Compromise of 1850, gets me thinking about the word compromise and whether that was ever appropriate to use. I think of compromise as two parties come together and they find something that's sort of mutually agreeable. And I wonder if what we were doing as a nation was more kicking the can down the road. And, did we potentially end up in a worse place? Would we have been better to have civil war in 1820 before technology made slavery so profitable and grow so much? And I'm just curious your sense of whether there ever really was a compromise that ended, or was it an inevitability that we were pushing ourselves towards?
Yeah, and there's also the question, compromise for who? So obviously, not a compromise for the 3 million enslaved people in the early 1850s. So I also think of as the Constitutional Convention as a compromise as well over questions of representation and slavery. I think what we can say is that for those generations, it was a compromise. But John Quincy Adams, who no one really ever confused with being a radical, he was in a presidential cabinet, Monroe's in 1820, when the Compromise of 1820 was passed, the Missouri Compromise. And he wrote privately to himself that he would rather that if the break has to come, he wasn't really thinking of a civil war, but a break in the Union. Let it come now because I'm tired of being attached to the American South. That is an argument. Your point is an argument that contemporaries did bring up at least as early as 1804. This was Jefferson's re-election massively. This was a year after the Louisiana Purchase, when Northerners, New Englanders, were sure that any new state that came into the Union from that massive territory was going to become slave territory for the Jeffersonians. They were looking to pull out of the country then. So I think in an early chapter, I quote from one of George Washington's former cabinet members who was trying to round up supports, secession, leave the Union. It's all there. Let's try to make this happen. So that sentiment was very much there. And I think kicking the can, as you put it, it's not a bad way to look at it.
Dr. Brown, thanks for coming tonight. I have a few questions for you, but I'm only going to ask one at a time, and we'll see if I can jump in later. Usually people talk about the Republican Party through the lens of Lincoln. You didn't do that in that chapter on the birth of the Republican Party. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to the framing over why and how the Republican Party was formed. Opponents of the party characterized Republicans as abolitionists, activists, whereas those within the party would say that's not entirely accurate. So could you tell us, was the Republican Party founded under the notion of preventing slavery from extending to the West, or was it founded as an abolitionist party?
The former, easily, the foundation. Lincoln says in November of 1854, I think I'm a Whig, but my friends say that there are no Whigs, and I am a Republican. His wife wrote to a correspondent, and she says, about this time, he's a Republican, but he's not an abolitionist. And so she drew the distinction, but I think that was the distinction that was probably consistent with most people who were Republicans in 1854, 55, 56. When Lincoln runs in 1860, this is about a year after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. And Democrats are saying, John Brown is the face of the Republican Party. And Republicans said, no, we are an anti-slave extensionist party, but we recognize the Constitution, the legality of slavery where it currently stands.
Dr. Brown, it's an honor. As a current student, I wanted to take this time to ask you, as far as your writing goes, when it comes to specifically your work, when it comes to your research, what would you say to students as far as finding your research and specifically your resources?
When you say find the research, do you mean picking a topic?
No, like whenever... like how you go in depth with your research and, find those specific resources to build on your topic.
Okay, sure. So I find that one source can lead you to another source, can lead you to another source, can lead you to another source. It's changed a lot in the last 20, 25 years because of the internet. It's a lot easier than it used to be. You could also, find some real classic works in the area, gut their bibliographies. I met Jeff tonight for the first time. I'm working on a project, Mark Twain. I found out that he used to work at the Twain House. There's a resource. I'm talking with him, and he's telling me, yeah, I actually know other people who can perhaps help you with this as well. So go to conferences, give papers, panels. Sometimes people will walk up, they'll give you a card. They'll say, I've been working on this project for 3 years, but it's not exactly what you're doing, but I think I could help you with it. You meet and greet, get out and meet people, go to conferences, and then, yeah, just do the grunt work of going through bibliographies. For a lot of primary research, you want to get familiar with archives and museums, and by now most of them have great online indexes.
Okay, I guess it's back to me. I also noticed in the book that you write a little bit about the emigration movement. So you talk in the beginning, in your talk here, you spoke about people moving west and 8 societies that exist that help people move west. But later on in the book, you address the debate amongst Black Americans, Black leaders who were exploring places where Black Americans could go, whether that's Canada or in Latin America or like the Niger Valley in Africa. And so you spend a lot of time talking about Delaney. So what I'd like you to do, because I know we have some students that are learning about this for the first time tonight, if you can talk a little bit about the immigration movement versus colonization, where Martin Delaney fits into that. And I'm just personally curious if you encountered the name William Howard Day at all in your research.
See, there it is. Like, there's a connection. I haven't, by the way. Could you give him the mic just really quick? I'm sorry. Real quick, who was he?
William Howard Day?
Yeah.
Okay, so he was a Black African-American abolitionist, educator, newspaper publisher. He printed John Brown's Constitution in Canada, but he was the third African-American to graduate from Oberlin. And he helped hide the Constitution and some of John Brown's men after the raid. He worked with Delaney and met Delaney in the Niger Valley, and they explored the Niger Valley together in 1859. And so I know that Day didn't spend a lot of time out in the Nebraska and Kansas territory, but he's part of the story that you tell in your book, particularly this part with emigration. And so I just wanted to just hear more about what you learned with the immigration movement as Black Americans were exploring whether or not we stay in the United States, we find refuge in Canada, and maybe launch a race war back in the United States and conduct that in exile in Canada, or leave the North America altogether and maybe find a place to live in the Niger Valley, another place of Africa, or maybe South America too.
Yeah, it was divided. There were those African Americans like Delaney who were immigrationists. And then there were others like Frederick Douglass that didn't want to see that happen, that said, as he wrote to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who ended Uncle Tom's Cabin with this kind of white fantasy of then once these African Americans are free, they'll leave and they'll go to Africa and they'll be Christians and they'll have a republic and that'll be nice. And Frederick Douglass wrote back and said something to the effect of like, great book, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here we are, and we're not going really anywhere. This is home. And then later in the book, there's the Delaney chapter, which I thought was a nice juxtaposition. I also thought it was a nice juxtaposition because of what we had talked about earlier. There's an earlier chapter in the book with William Walker. So Walker is going to Nicaragua. He's going to take over the country. It's not exactly clear with Delaney or other Black nationalists who are looking to go abroad that theirs would have been a necessarily peaceful venture, or if they would have had to have fought for the land, so to speak. So in that sense, I find the movement very interesting because in one sense I think it does anticipate Pan-Africanism of the future, looking towards, for example, Garvey, even later than that, Malcolm X. But in another sense, I look at where they held their conventions, which were oftentimes in church buildings. They drafted constitutions. They talked, not unlike Martin Delany, about going overseas. So in some respects, it was kind of an early iteration of Pan-Africanism, but it was also pitched in the idiom that the audience, these Americans of African descent, would have recognized. Here we are in a church structure or a community hall where we're asking for, we're demanding our rights as citizens. And we deserve this, and if we can't find it here, we will, as what? As a chosen people, as Americans, do what Americans do, which is to pick up and cross an ocean and establish our home elsewhere.
So one last thing, and by the way, that name, William Howard Day, I noticed you're at E-Town. He's buried here in Harrisburg, at Lincoln Cemetery, in the Pembroke part of Harrisburg.
Delaney's buried about 45 minutes from my childhood home.
Okay, all right. Well, this is a yes or no. If you want to elaborate, feel free. But I've often thought of this, and I don't know if I'm right. I don't know if my thought is right. But if we're talking about black nationalists, Delaney, Day, Hezekiah, Ford Douglass, others who are exploring land elsewhere outside the United States, even back in Africa, can we say that that's not some form of colonization that could take place if black Americans ended up settling in Africa? And if that would be bad?
Well, that's what I was kind of thinking about with my comparison to William Walker. So whether we call it a form of imperialism or colonization, I wouldn't disagree with what you're saying.
We have time for one last question.
Just piggybacking on that line of questioning, somewhere I think I read that Kansas itself was seen as a potential promised land for formerly enslaved blacks. Did you encounter that in your research?
I did see it. I didn't write it up because it wasn't really part of the narrative of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There were contested claims. Should some of the territory be allotted for African Americans? What about the Native Americans who were already there? This all gets subsumed, I think, under the larger kind of Bibles and guns, border warfare that we see from these New Englanders who are coming in and the Missouri ruffians. In part because it's this iconic backdrop of the sections, and particularly the New Englanders, they wrote so much about it, so we have that history. But yes, there was some question, as there were questions in other territories, in other states at other times, about is this a place where African peoples could live?
Can we give one more round of applause for David and Jeffrey? Thank you to David. Thank you to Jeffrey. Another thank you to the National Civil War Museum for partnering with us. We're about to have a book signing over at this table here. Again, this is publication day. This is the launch. So if you haven't bought your copy, you can go up to the cafe. We've got plenty of copies there. And thanks for coming out, everyone. Have a good night.